I am going to teach Victorian novel. And you know that Victorian period is basically known for its novel. This is the era of novel. You know, and novel reached in its peak form in Victorian time. Most of the greatest English novelists, they wrote in this time, and they were talking about the contemporary issue, that is social, industrial, ethical, right, transformative. So most of the Victorian writers, they were talking about the what we call Victorian sensibility, Victorian compromise, Victorian reality, Victorian dogma, Victorian morality, Victorian ethos. तो यदि आपका क्वेश्चन उठता है फॉर्म्स एंड मूवमेंट में, फॉर एग्जांपल कि व्हाट डू यू नो अबाउट विक्टोरियनिज्म, राइट एन एसे ऑन विक्टोरियन नॉवेल, so that you should know that these novelists, this era is particularly known for Victorian novel, for novel. And you know that novel is the new form, right? It is a new form. There is something called new. So this new is very important. So when you read novel, you should know that how novel is new. And there is an essay written by Mikhail Bakhtin. It is called Epic and Novel. You know, Mikhail Bakhtin has written an essay. Mikhail Bakhtin has written an essay called Epic and Novel. So novel is something that is called new. There is something newness, new idea, you know, new reality. So novel means new. There is something called newness. Second thing is that when you read novel, Victorian novel is basically known for its simplicity. They raise common issue. They raise common issue that were prevalent in Victorian society. Most of the novels, they were written in serial form. They were serialized. Most of the Victorian novel, they were serialized. That is to say that they were written in serial form. They were written in serial form. This serialization is very important. Serial means like Ramayana serial, Mahabharata serial that you see in television. So most of the novels of Victorian era, they were written in serial form. And they were talking about realism. Realism is the core issue. Realism is the core issue. यथार्थ की बात करते हैं. Most of the Victorian novel, they talk about realism, right? There is no such thing like fantasy or romantic. You don't find romantic, right? They are realistic and they are ethical and social transformation. So if Victorian poetry, if you read that Victorian poetry is the poem of that explores the nature of Victorian era, in the same way the Victorian poem, Victorian novel are also the novels of Victorian sensibility, of Victorian society. कैसे वो समाज आया. और कुछ किताबों का आप नाम पढ़िएगा जब आप विक्टोरियन लिटरेचर पढ़ेंगे उसमें कुछ किताबों का नाम है, जिसमें पहली किताब है, एक किताब है डेविड सेसिल, एक किताब है डेविड सेसिल, जिन्होंने लिखा है विक्टोरियन नॉवेल। कौन किताब? विक्टोरियन नॉवेल। और एक किताब लिखी गई है एफ आर लेविस, एफ आर लेविस, इनकी किताब का नाम है द ग्रेट ट्रेडिशन, द ग्रेट ट्रेडिशन। सो अकॉर्डिंग टू एफ आर लेविस, that some of the Victorian writers, they are the part of what we call the great tradition, and he includes not Dickens. This is very interesting point. He does not include Dickens, right? Right? There is a George Eliot. He includes George Eliot. Even later, the writer like Hardy, even Jane Austen, but he does not include Dickens. And then F.R. Lewis has written a separate book on. Therefore, David Cecil has written. David Cecil, or there is one writer also. I think that it is F.R. Lewis or David Cecil. David Cecil, who has written a separate book on Charles Dickens. So, the major Victorian novelists are Charles Dickens, George Eliot, Bronte sister, William Thackeray, George Eliot, William Thackeray, right? Bram Stoker, who has written a book called Dracula, right? Bram Stoker, Dracula. Then you have, as I told you, Thomas Hardy, right? So these are some of the great writers. So keep mind these writers when you read. Other writers is like Gaskell, R.P. Blackmore, So these are the major writers who wrote in this time. And then you must keep in mind that, as I told you, that when you read these writers, you find exact sensibility of Victorian era. Right? There is Lewis Carroll, who has written a book called Alice in Wonderland. So these are the major writers. अब आप जब कोई आपसे क्वेश्चन पूछा जाएगा तो जस्ट इन माय प्रीवियस वीडियो, as I told you that all these writers, they were talking about Victorian sensibility. That is the time of Victorian time is the time when Industrial Revolution reaches in its peak form. That's why there is a social transformation. Then there is a, as I told you, that there is a complex realism. So a lot of problems also emerged at that time. And all these writers, they are the true representative writer of the Victorian society. There is a question of England also. Then there is a question of moral and social illness, right? And then there is a Gothic sensibility. There is a Gothic. Gothic is also a form of novel. Gothic. Bram Stoker's Dracula is a Gothic novel. It is a Gothic novel. It is a Gothic novel, right? This is a Gothic novel. So Gothic novel is also very important. So that is what we call Gothic novel. Then there is a building roman. You see, this is the term that you should also read. That there is a called building roman. This is very important term. Buildings roman means a development of a character. Of a character. And therefore, when you read Charles Dickens, in fact, his great novel like David Copperfield, like Great Expectation, like Oliver Twist, they are the representative of building roman. For example, David Copperfield. If you see David Copperfield, that character is a David, and David has, in fact, two basic pursuits. That is to find out a good job and to find out the good suitable wife, right? Good suitable wife, good suitable partner. That is a problem. This is a reality. Most of the novels that they talk about the Victorian reality, and the Victorian reality is this reality that basically they are talking about the search for search for our basic aim, and aim is number one, that we need a suitable job and we need a suitable partner. And this is a building roman, that there is development of a character, So in David Copperfield, you find the development of David. In Great Expectation, you find the development of Pip. Pip is the major character. And in Oliver Twist, you find the development of Oliver. Right? So that is very important, that these writers, they talk about the development of a character. Right? So that is also you should keep in mind, that when you read Victorian period, that at the same time the building roman also emerged, the social reality also emerged. And Charles Dickens has written extensively, like Christmas Carol, like Christmas Carol, that he has also written Dombey and Son. He has also written a very famous novel called Dombey and Son. Then he has written also A Tale of Two Cities. This is a historical novel. A Tale of Two Cities, right? That this novel, बहुत बार क्वेश्चन पूछा गया है टीजीटी में, पीजीटी में, कि दिस नॉवेल डील्स विद द इशू ऑफ टू सिटी. One is called Paris and second is called London. Paris and London. So that it was the worst of time, it was the best of time, right? So Charles Dickens has written extensively, but he is known for his basic major novel. Like he has also written a novel called Dombey and Son. He has also written a novel called Our Mutual Friend, right? So that is his basic novel, right? So he has also written a picaresque novel. And Pickwick Paper, for example, Pickwick Paper. He has written called Pickwick Paper. Pickwick paper, and this is called a picaresque novel. This is called a picaresque novel, Pickwick paper, right? So that is how, firstly, you must analyze the novel of Charles Dickens, and basically you should know that most of his novel, that they are talking about the social reality, they are talking about the historical fact, like Tale of Two Cities, and there is some picaresque sensibility. But he is known for his three major novels, that is Great Expectation, then you have David Copperfield, and then you have is another novel that is we call that's what we call his major novel is Great Expectation, David Copperfield, and then there is Oliver Twist, right? So please read these three novels. That how there is orphanage issue, how there is a, and he creates the certain types of characters, that there is a robbery scene, there is a there is a treachery, there is a betrayal, there is orphanage. So most of the issues that were pertinent at that society, that these issues were raised by Charles Dickens in his most of the novels. And then, as I told you, then we come to another novelist, and that the novelist that is called George Eliot. George Eliot. You know, George Eliot has written, it is his pen Mary Evans. In fact, his name is Mary Evans. कई बार यूजीसी नेट में क्वेश्चन पूछा है, मैरी एवंस. He has written major novel like Adam Bede, Silas Marner, The Mill and the Flowers, Daniel Doranda, These are his major novel, right? So that is George Eliot, who talks about the theme of suffering, the theme of pain, the theme of suffering, and also there is a theme of pain. However, the human relationship that George Eliot basically deals with the issue of human relations. This is called the human relationship, right? This is the core issue of George Eliot, human relationship. And as I told you that there is some spirituality, there is a sense of spirituality, right? Because George Eliot has translated a book by Feuerbach. It is called The Life of Christ. The Life of Jesus Christ. This book was translated by George Eliot. So in George Eliot, there is what we call a sense of spirituality. And then you have, remember, Charles Dickens, as I told you, that he has touched most of the social issue. Like for example, his novel is called Bleak House. His novel is called Bleak House. This novel deals with the issue of the delay of law. The delay of law. You know, as there is a saying that law delay is law denied. वो कहते हैं कि यदि डिसीजन में देरी हो गया तो क्या मतलब है डिसीजन का, राइट? सो उसी प्रकार से जॉर्ज एलियट सी डील्स बेसिकली द इशू ऑफ रिलीजियस सेंटिमेंटलिटी, human bond, right? He has also, and rural setting, Middlemarch. Another novel is called Middlemarch. Middlemarch. The subtitle of the a story of the provincial England. So, in the novel of uh, George Eliot, you find the sensibility of the sensibility of the sensibility of rural life. How rural life is portrayed in George Eliot's life. However, the novel of Charles Dickens, they basically deals the issue of city life, urban life, right? Then there is a Elizabeth Gaskell, who has written a book called Elizabeth Gaskell, and whose book is Elizabeth Gaskell, who has written a book called North and South. North and South. It is in 1854. North and South. So this is a book by Elizabeth Gaskell, who has written a book called North and South. And then you have, as I told you, Lewis Carroll. So then there is a William Thackeray, who was born in Calcutta. William Thackeray, who has written a book called Vanity Fair, a novel without a hero. So this is also the book by William Thackeray, who has written only basically this book. And then we come to Thomas Hardy. So ध्यान दीजिएगा, इतने राइटर को जब पढ़ेंगे तो ये राइटर बेसिकली विक्टोरियन सेंसिबिलिटी की बात करते हैं, विक्टोरियन मोरालिटी की बात करते हैं, विक्टोरियन एथिक की बात करते हैं. They talk about Victorian ethic, they talk about Victorian morality, they talk about Victorian sensibility, a core issue pertinent in Victorian society. जो विक्टोरियन सोसाइटी में कोर इशू था उसकी बात करते हैं. और कहीं ना कहीं दे हैड अ सेंस ऑफ कैमरादरी, अ सेंस ऑफ that bonhomie, or a sense of thinking about a similar issue, that is Victorian society. They were basically welcomed by Victorian writer. They had a sense of nursing creative flaw, and there was a beautiful bond between reader and writer. They were greatly admired by Victorian society, Victorian reader. इतना समझने का प्रयास करिएगा. And therefore their novels were serialized or they were very popular in their time. इतना ध्यान रखिएगा. These writers, basically George Eliot, William Thackeray, Gaskell. There is a Bronte sisters, Emily Bronte and Charlotte Bronte. There is a Bronte sister. Charlotte Bronte, right? And then you have Charlotte Bronte, Emily Bronte. These they are the writers of Wuthering Heights, and Jane Eyre, and Jane Eyre. So they have written Wuthering Heights and Jane Eyre. So they are Bronte sisters. So these writers, they are great writers, and they are the writers who portrayed very beautifully the picture of what we call Victorian society, the picture of Victorian sensibility, the picture of Victorian logic, the picture of Victorian society. However, when we come to Thomas Hardy, the situation is quite different. जब हम थॉमस हार्डी पे आते हैं तो now the situation is quite different. Thomas Hardy has, at least he has written the novel which were completely opposite of Victorian sensibility. थॉमस हार्डी का जो नॉवेल है दे आर कंप्लीटली विक्टोरियन सेंसिबिलिटी, और उसमें जो सबसे फेमस नॉवेल है दैट इज टेस ऑफ द डूबरवाइल, published in 1891, though he has written some other novels like The Mayor of Costa Bridge, The Mayor of Costa Bridge, right? He has also written The Return of the Native, The Return of the Native. Then Jude the Obscure. Then Tess of the Duberville, right? These are his. These are some of his major novels. But when you read Thomas Hardy, इनके आते आते तक इन विक्टोरियन सोसाइटी में एक टर्म आता है नाटी नाइनटीज, और उसी समय अपार्ट फ्रॉम 1990s there is aesthetic movement. There is aesthetic movement. This is called aesthetic movement, right? Then there is what we call decadence period. What we call decadence period. This is called aesthetic movement or decadence period. Decadence period. And this decadence period and aesthetic period are what we call 1990s period. These periods are the completely opposite of Victorian sensibility in certain way. For example, Tess of the Duberville, when you read this text, what you find that there is a certain issues which are against the Victorian morality. You know, there is a term called Victorian sexual code. This was Victorian morality. That the Victorian, this was what we call Victorian sexual code, and this is called morality. You know, good, moral, ethical. This is what we call art. Art is moral. उन्होंने कहा कि आर्ट है तो इट इज अ मोरल, यह मोरल है. आर्ट इज मोरालिटी की बात नहीं करता तो आर्ट तो नहीं है. इसीलिए जितने भी राइटर थे इनका जो लिटरेचर था, दे लिटरेचर दे बेसिकली दे वर द सब्जेक्ट ऑफ मोरल इशू. देयर वाज मोरल, देयर वाज एजुकेशन, देयर वाज एजुकेशन, देयर वाज अ मोरल इशू, राइट? देयर वाज सर्टेन टीचिंग. और इसीलिए कहा गया कि आर्ट इज फॉर लाइफ से. लिसन, दिस इज वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट. आर्ट इज फॉर लाइफ से. कहा जो आर्ट है इट इज नॉट फॉर आर्ट लाइफ से, कि जीवन के लिए होना चाहिए. कहा जो नॉवेल विक्टोरियन सोसाइटी में लिखे गए दे वर बेसिकली रिटन फॉर लाइफ, हमारे जिंदगी के लिए लिखे गए, हमारे जीवन के लिए लिखे गए, हमारे जीवन को एक शिक्षा देने के लिए लिखे गए, हमारे जीवन को एक मोरालिटी, एक नैतिकता के लिए लिखे गए. जितने भी नावल थे दे वर रिटन बिकॉज ऑफ द मोरालिटी ऑफ विक्टोरियन सोसाइटी। इसी के बाद जो टॉमस हार्डी आते हैं, उनका जो लेटर नॉवेल्स है, खासतौर से उनके अर्लियर नॉवेल द मेयर ऑफ कास्टब्रिज, दैट इज हाईली पेसिमिस्टिक, द रिटर्न ऑफ नेटिव इज आल्सो पेसिमिस्टिक, बट व्हेन यू रीड हिज नॉवेल द टेस्ट ऑफ द डूबर वाइल्ड, that there is a what you call sexual connotation, right? There is a, because taste is seduced, taste is seduced, the taste is seduced, taste is seduced. Then there is issue like seduction, there is a issue like seduction, and ultimately taste is hanged, taste is hanged. और जो लास्ट लाइन है इस नावल का, विच इज वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट, दैट द प्रेसिडेंट ऑफ इमॉर्टल, दैट द प्रेसिडेंट ऑफ इमॉर्टल हैज ended his sports with taste, like for example, destiny is character, destiny is character. As you find this in Greek literature, what we call destiny is character. तो ये इन्होंने, टॉमस हार्डी ने नियत पे विश्वास किया। इन्होंने कहा कि जीवन में नियत सब कुछ है। जैसे किंग लियर की एक लाइन है, वेरी फेमस लाइन, एज फ्लाइज आर वांटन टू वॉयज, वी आर टू गॉड, they merely kill us for their sports. So when you read Tales of the Duber Wild, you find certain things that how there is a issue of sexual connotation. और इसी से जो शुरुआत होती है टॉमस हार्डी से, उसके बाद आता है एस्थेटिक मूवमेंट, एस्थेटिक मूवमेंट। हालांकि मैं एस्थेटिक मूवमेंट को और मैं डिकेडेंस को आई विल टेक अप सेपरेटली। इन एस्थेटिक मूवमेंट यू हैव ऑस्कर वाइल्ड, who has written a book called the picture of Dorian Gray, and in the preface of the picture of Dorian Gray he says that all art by definition is immoral, which means that art is for art's sake, art is not for writer's sake, art is not for reader's sake, art is for art's sake. तो मैं यहां तक पढ़ाने के बाद टुडे आई स्टॉप माई, और मैं आई विल टेक अप सेपरेटली व्हाट वी कॉल एस्थेटिक, व्हाट वी कॉल डिकेडेंस पीरियड, व्हाट वी कॉल 1990s पीरियड, एंड हाउ they later paved the way for what we call, how they later paved the way for Victorian society, how they later paved the way for Victorian, how they later paved the way for modern literature. So thank you. Today I stop here. In my next period I will pick up aesthetic and decadence and 1990s period. Thank you. यही पढ़ाते हैं।